bunch. And there's some really good things, but I also want to sort of push on folks because we'll send out a message on Piazza. I think for some groups, there was a way that people just sort of went with the consensus where they said, well, we all sort of agree this is maybe not the best thing, but we all are sort of at least agreeing on this. And so we have a overwhelmingly large amount of projects that I know they might change, so I'm taking a snapshot, maybe they've already changed since that assignment went in. There are a large number of them that are about sort of crime, looking for crime. This is a very noble application. I just don't want to have 20 crime apps. That would be very kind of, so I'm sort of pushing on you to try to think even broader, or if you don't have something really remarkably kind of novel in that kind of design space, or you're worried you're going to not be able to come up with something, then let us know, or you need to go back to your group and sort of brainstorm or create some of the other ideas. The other one is there's a lot of them that are about, I'll broadly categorize sort of tourism. It's sort of find cool things nearby. Also very cool, and it could be something, if you have a very novel take on that, there could be some interesting design insights or how you do the design experience or something that involves a watch a little bit differently. But again, it would be, I wouldn't want to have, half the class do crime and half the class do tourism. So if you're in one of those spaces, I'm not saying you can't do that, but I'm just saying for sure go back to your group and just have a kind of discussion. Are we really 100% behind this idea, or there's some other things you want to bring up? Because you still have a couple of days to kind of formulate what you're going to do. So this is the sort of announcement I had written down. So let me see if I missed something. So number one, please make a plan for programming assignment 2, because I know it's coming down to the wire. There's lots of things you suddenly are realizing that even though this assignment was given weeks and weeks ago, that, oh my gosh, it's due next week. And so thinking about what still needs to be done, so please plan for that. Design 4 is when we need you to tell us what your actual project is going to be, because we then will do a little bit of sort of further checking on that to see if we need to kind of meet with you and do a little bit of tweaking. So that's a very simple assignment, but we want to know everyone's locked in an idea. We don't want to go across the midterm and have people show up after the midterm and go, our group never decided anything. For sure, your group should have a regular meeting time, okay? And that's my message that I just kind of hit on, be bold and creative. So think about it this way. Yes, you're doing an assignment in this class, there's going to be a grade, all the things, but really, I'm interested in you having a really amazing portfolio piece to show off to, I don't know, investors or people you get hired by, or just have to show how you think about and deconstruct kind of technology and innovation. So if you choose something that if you looked at and thought, I could get this to work, but honestly it's pretty boring, that's not going to make a good portfolio piece. You will have plenty of time in other parts of your career to probably make a couple boring things. Don't let this class be that one time you make the boring thing. Design 5 has gone out. This is a longer term. It's going to be due way after the midterm, not way after the midterm, but it's involving a group assignment where you're going to be looking more specifically at the users. You're going to be doing those things we talked about in class with context analysis, picking tasks that your application would use, and some competitive analysis. So that will be due after the midterm. But I just want to put in a pointer. I am completely aware that no one has rushed off and done this assignment, but I don't want it to fall off people's radar. Next week, our talk will be on user studies and data analysis. That will kind of wrap up most of the kind of big chunks of the course, because then we'll have the midterm, not next week, but the following week from 1 to 2:30, and we're going to have room assignments in here and things. I'll go over that in a second. Also, I know you're just rocking on in this class, but you're also thinking what's going on in spring. So it ends up that I will be teaching CS160 again in the spring. So for people that want to suffer through me one more time, no, I'm just kidding, you guys will be fine. But I'm mainly telling you because I have a hard time. I'd like to kind of reach all the students, so you guys know a lot of folks. So let the word be out that CS160 will be offered next semester. It will be in Jacobs Hall again. It will be spread across 2 days, not 1 day like we have it. And it will be same scale, about 200 students. I will be teaching it again. And then everyone will be free of me. I won't be teaching CS160 for a while after that, probably at least a year. So for those of you that want to escape me, just wait one semester. Those that want to actually take the class with me, you guys pick it next semester. Okay. And also, the real reason I put that up there is because I'll be looking for people to help with the class. A lot of you probably had some really great interactions with the GSIs and the readers, and I'll be looking for those to help out with spring 2016. And some of you from this class, particularly you're doing really well, and by the end of the term, if you do quite well, then we might consider you for some kind of position in the class. So think about that. You want to keep thinking about HCI, you want to be more involved, you kind of a leadership role, but please keep that in mind. One thing about the midterm, I'll cover a little more specifics next week, but in class, roughly 80 minutes, right? Closed book and notes. We're going to run a whole review section in the sections next Friday. And if you're registered at DSP, you'll receive something from me by Monday. If you don't, then you should contact me. We'll have some mapping for all the rooms based on your names because not everyone fits in here. We have to move people around, so that will go out as well. Questions about any of those things? Okay. The watches are here. The watches are here. So you saw this at lunch. We're going to hand out the watches, and it's basically one a group, and I think all the information went out. Basically, you just have to fill out that feedback form so we know who's the contact, who's responsible, and we need to check that we'll just hold. We're not going to cash it, but if we don't get the watch back, then we cash it, and we go to Vegas, we double that, all this good stuff happens. All right, so one thing I want to talk about graphic design, a lot of the reference comes from just many different sources, but two that were really compelling. One is this Sticking with Type, this book by Ellen Lupton, and also I used some material from Shana, who actually was a reader with the class a number of semesters ago, and also runs a really cool decal that I support her with working with typography. So if you really get interested in this area, there's an awesome decal that's still being taught, not by her, but it's still being taught. Okay, so graphic and product design. We're going to cover a kind of wide space of kind of things. The first thing I want to communicate is that when you're doing something with any kind of graphic design, any kind of visual elements, that includes the typography, it includes all these kinds of visual representations. There's a lot of different things that you might be doing. And usually you're trying to communicate some kind of information, right? So this is a kind of typical kind of map you might have about Death Valley or something. There are lots of visual elements at play. And there's lots of design thinking that goes into this. It's not just arbitrarily laid out. It's also about interpretation. So you can communicate a lot through your actual graphic design or your typography. So in these particular examples, one of them is sort of, this is for a race, like an auto race, and this is sort of a poster for a music concert, and both of them convey a certain sense of what might happen there, right? So these visual elements are really important, and you can imagine if you're designing, you know, a watch that does something about watching crime or tourism or something else, you would want to have that as part of the messaging. Another important thing is to have kind of corporate branding or some kind of design language, which was really started early with IBM, who came up with this branding. You can see they have the kind of listing of all the sort of variations of how they can give messaging about their company, and it kind of goes all across their product line. And now you have this with even a broader media landscape. So you think about not just the print, but also, you know, all kinds of swag and all kinds of interfaces through tablets and other devices. And of course, there's branding even on individual sort of websites and things like that. So let's look at typography. So a couple of things, this is what I'm talking about is the actual type, the kind of letters that are forming the kind of words or text. And a lot of times you think of this as an afterthought, like, okay, let's just put the text down, let's get it, maybe focus on the images. You should think of the type as a really first-class citizen. So a couple things, typography exists to honor the content. And you sort of saw that originally in that other one, that typography spoke to that music concert or to that auto race. And usually you want to read the text before designing with it. Okay? It's very strange to just lay out some text and not know what you're sort of trying to convey as a message. And you choose some typeface that matches the characteristics or the text of the data. Now, just some history, I think folks know this, but letterpress, which really came from these very early printing technology from Gutenberg and others, where they basically made movable type that you could move around and you could actually reposition. This is a picture of the sort of Gutenberg Bible as it was printed, about 1450. And the sort of typography, and a couple things to notice about it. First, that the actual typography is a reference to the sort of way that people use calligraphy nibs. So it's supposed to mimic that style. And also that there's these other illustrations kind of embedded in there. So there's this illuminated manuscript, this kind of ways that things were sort of also added to the text around it to convey extra meaning, or using this case, it was around sort of religious beatification. So what we're really talking about is, in the early days, it's not that long ago, honestly, that someone would actually move the type around, that's sort of their movable type. They would put these sort of plates in, and they would actually press it to create different sort of output, basically some kind of imagery. And you would choose the different letters from these boxes. And typically, in a letterpress printing shop, you would have one case that held the letters that were the larger letters and then the lower letters. And that's where we get kind of uppercase and lowercase from. Because the uppercase, literally the case, would hold the uppercase letters, and the lowercase would hold the lowercase letters. So there's a lot of kind of evolution of this. So if you just roughly look at this image, you'll see sort of some broad strokes of typography. So back in 1465, we had a particular style. You can see kind of 1890, and as it moves across into the early 20th century, and then later towards this end of this century, you see the way that the typography sort of changes and adapts, and there's sort of a modernization. There's sort of a more of a simplification going on in a lot of it. One thing to note is, are we talking about fonts? Or are we talking about typography? Or what are we talking about? And this is what fonts were originally like. So fonts, when you say font, you're really talking about, at least if we can leave computers behind for a minute, you're working in a letterpress shop. The font were literally these individual press letters that you would put down. And so it's the typeface is the design of the actual sort of design of the actual letters, whereas the fonts are kind of the implementation of them. So it's still, we still use that term because technically fonts are now digital files that contain letter forms. They're the thing that actually creates the impression. So the typefaces are the look of all the characters in this particular font. So in this example, Helvetica is a typeface. It's a font family which is made up of many fonts, and a font is a specific size and weight of a typeface. So it makes sense if you think about back to this picture, because you might have a particular font, but someone might say, use the sort of 20-point bold, and you have to go into the drawer and get the actual font that was, 20-point bold of that particular typeface. So just to reiterate that again, typeface versus font. The typeface is the design of the letter form, so how you're actually designing the letter form, and the font is the delivery mechanism, be it these sort of the small metal sort of fonts, or the fonts you use in an actual digital tool. So you design a typeface, but you actually kind of make a font. And a font is what you use, a typeface is more what you see. So when you're designing, the design is of that typeface. This is sort of what it might look like. Someone might go and actually design the actual typeface. So sort of someone. Yeah, so this is just someone designing it, this particular typeface. So just so you understand that when you're using these letters, sometimes I think many times, and I do this too, you just quickly maybe grab some particular font that you want to use from some typeface family, and you use it and you move on. I just want you to realize that people actually spend lots of time designing and thinking about all kinds of form and balance in these typefaces. So they're quite important, and they can really be a significant contributor towards the way that you communicate something. Now, there's all these movements and styles of different uses of typefaces. So I think one of the early, at least around the 19th century, with the rise of advertising, there was a lot of sort of large-scale lettering that was used in sort of advertising. It's sort of funny, it's like a policeman coming around, like, I don't know, knock that guy upside the head for doing that. But you'll notice there's a lot of different stuff. So here, first of all, this is, I don't know, at least 15 different fonts going on. So a lot of different typefaces that use. And it's also at this very center, this is after like a sort of steamship cruise. And these are chosen to sort of maximize the use of each line, but it's also very boring. It's kind of almost like a tombstone. So here's some more little anatomy about typefaces, and I'm not expecting you to know every single bit of these, but the fact that they actually have terminology for all of these different parts of typeface and how you design it and the sizing. Now, one thing is, many of you should be knowledgeable to know what a serif is. I think folks know what a serif is. We'll look at it. So this is, actually, I have a little thing here. All right, I have zero way of pointing here, but if you look on the R in typography at the top, there's a little 2 arrows that say serif to the bottom part of the R. So it's these extra little bits that are coming out. They're often considered sort of decorative, but they also serve to kind of weight or kind of ground the typography or that particular glyph. Now, if we say sans serif, that means without serif. So these are sans serif fonts. If you look, there's no serifs anywhere. There's none of this sort of adornment on the sides. And this is a little bit more of a kind of modern style because there's been general movements about moving towards sans serif fonts. This is a reference to the kind of older or humanist style. You'll see here the way there are serifs and also the way that there's kind of this diagonal stress in some of these. Now, some of them are easier to read in particular context, and we'll show how you can kind of use them to balance out. There's no one typeface that's going to be best for everything. It's about designing again. This is just a different style, kind of modern style. So these are some examples. You'll see that the stress now is much more vertical. Or the serif can be a little bit more of a slab. So you'll see it sort of pitched up a little bit, and you'll recognize maybe some of these New Century School wrote these kinds of slab serif fonts. It's good to have just a general knowledge of the kind of different choices or categorizations, not only for your own sort of skill, but also because often tools will ask to use selection tools using this criteria. So if you're looking for some kind of typeface to use, the first thing will, well, should it be serif or sans serif or should it be slab or whatever. This is another example of these. So the thing to notice is there's very subtle differences sometimes, but they're particularly important to a designer. So here's some more sans serif fonts. Again, slight variations in those, particularly with the kind of A with Futura. It's basically got much more of a point on the top, and the way that the lowercase a is represented is different across them. So another property of working with any kind of typeface or font is you're going to be choosing the size. It's typically in points, and you choose that. Nowadays, actually, you have a lot of choices because it's all digital, so you sort of choose arbitrarily. A point is about 1/72 of an inch. And a pica is really more about a column width, that's what it's based on. But one thing to also notice, if you look at this W down here, the size, it says the metal type, in metal type, the point size is the height of the type slug. And if you look, the typeface is measured from the top of the capital letter to the bottom of the lowest dissenter, so that'll be G, plus a small buffer space. Just, you should have some working knowledge that that's actually, when you're specifying the size, it's like, are you specifying the size of the B or just the whole area? It's like, it's a little bit different than that. And this comes into play with the way you choose them, how you make selections around font sizes. So sometimes you might want to use smaller or larger sizes to make them more readable, bring out a headline. And there's also things like the bottom, which says the caption styles are built with the heaviest stroke weight. They're designed for sizes ranging from 6 to 8 points. So they're actually kind of designed to work on a smaller scale and be more readable. Now, there's also a type family, okay? And you can think about, in this example here, the top one is sort of Adobe Garmon and Pro Regular. This is sort of a standard font. You could use sort of readable, and you can use it for text. You can also choose an italic. Okay, this is another font family. That might be a way to generate some emphasis. I'll show you some other examples of that. And then you can also use small caps. So small caps are not sort of capital letters just shrunk down. They are specifically designed as part of this sort of font family, as the typography family. And this could be integrated with text when full-size caps would stand out awkwardly. So think if you wanted to say something and then write in all caps, that might really stand out and be visually awkward, whereas a choice like small caps, if it's done right, could be really compelling. There's bold and also semi-bold, and in fact, often if you're choosing a really good quality typeface, you'll actually get lots of different sizes and weightings involved in design. And by that gives you a chance to emphasize things within a hierarchy, so you can sort of have a little bit more selection criteria besides just bold or not bold. And then sometimes there's combinations, which can be good, it can also get you into a little bit of trouble. One thing about italics are not slanted letters, okay? So if you look, here's the first of our first type crimes. Who was at the scene of the crime? Often someone will take a sort of typeface or some font that was slanted, and it's just really awkward. And in fact, some italics aren't slanted at all. So for this particular font, this particular typography is basically, it's not slanted. And here's how you can, I'll just point out, this is one of those things, now that I tell you this, you'll go, oh, I see that, that's really bad. I wish you would have told me that, because now look at how crappy that stuff looks. So if you look, here's Proxima Nova bold at the top. The middle is if you just slant it. I call this fake italic, because it's not really italic. Then Proxima Nova bold italic at the bottom. Now what do people notice that's different between the bottom two? What's that? Yeah, first of all, the O on the bottom is really symmetrically balanced. That's really visually appealing. That one is really kind of just crooked, right? It's like slanted. It's just someone who's a typographer went and actually designed the italic font. So they went and did that, and they got this beautiful looking version at the bottom. The middle is really messed up. A couple other things, you mentioned the S. Because of that sort of skewing, the S has, it varies basically in its thickness, and it's not consistent, right? It gets all out of whack, the S and the O. The A as well, the thickness is a little messed up. Does anyone see that? Or am I the only one seeing this? Now you see it. Now you're messed up, because you're going to see this all the time. You're going to go, why are they using fake italics? That's bugging me. I'm going to track them down. Don't be that person. As I mentioned, you also get a lot of choices of weights. And if you choose a font with a lot of different sort of weights, then you can really have some beautiful choices for how to lay out. Imagine you're doing a poster and you're using and you basically can choose a same sort of font family here, and you can basically move through the different typographies, and you'll get a chance to kind of have something that visually is consistent, because it's the same typeface, but you have it in different ways. I'm not going to list every possible tool you can use, but one of them, because I know you guys get this for free, Adobe Typekit, if you get the whole Adobe suite. Adobe Typekit lets you go in and choose different fonts and types, and you can see there's this little selection criteria where you can say, I'm looking for a sans serif font that has particular weighting and so different kinds of properties, and you can easily do all your favorite search tools. And you can put these on web pages, and you can download them. It syncs across all of your computers. I know there's lots of other tools. I'm just going to mention this one because it's fairly nice. And if you look, when I pull up Proxmonova, you'll notice there's a huge selection. I can sort of see all the different choices of weighting. So immediately I might say, oh, this is really nice. I'm going to take that. Another property of working with typography is getting the spacing right. So there are two main properties. One is you can either have proportional, so you can see how each letter is actually using a specific proportion, or it can be monospace. Okay, and there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So if you look, there are two other properties I want you to know about. In terms, okay, so at the top I wrote, I dream of robot delights, and then I dream of robot delights. And both of those, one of them is in proportional, one of them is in mono. This might create different visual effects, or you might want to sort of do some alignment. That's another reason to use monospace. Two other things about spacing, and these are tools that you should use. I know a lot of people don't really use these, but once you start to use them, they can really create some beautiful visual and sort of graphic and typography. So letter spacing, often called tracking, is the consistent degree of increase or sometimes decrease of space between letters to affect density in a line or block of text. And so I wrote the same thing. I drew robot delights, and then this has some increased letter spacing. I think it's about 5% or something, very subtle, but kind of draws it out. This could be good for balancing some particular space, or I tightened it up, which could also create another dramatic effect. This is different than kerning. Kerning is when you're basically adjusting the spacing between two letters, okay, in a usually proportional font. So you can see the example there, the A and the D with no kerning, and then with kerning, they're sort of tucked in a little tighter. All right, let's talk about alignment. So you have all these choices about how to align some kind of text. So center text is symmetrical, like a facade of a classic building. Center type often appears on invitations, title pages, certificates, and tombstones. The edges of a center column are often dramatically uneven. That could be good or bad, depending on what you want. Center text should be broken to emphasize a key phrase, such as midterm tomorrow, rather than saying midterm tomorrow. Breaking lines in this manner is called breaking for sense. Please do this, and it'll be really dramatic. You have to do something centered. Think about what the meaning is. Think about where the natural break is, because you're in this particular thing. You might be, if I played with some more typography, you might be drawn to that right in the center, midterm tomorrow. Where when it's broken across, it's just not as visually communicative of what you're trying to say. So what about justification? So, like all these, there's good and bad. So justify text which has even edges on both the left and right sides of the column has in the norm since the invention of printing with movable type, which enabled the creation of page after page of straight edge columns. So in metal typesetting, the printer justified lines by hand. So they had these little metal pieces in there, which you could have seen when I was back on a previous slide, and thus make the lines the same length. Digital typesetters perform the same labor automatically. Justified type makes efficient use of space. It also creates a clean, compact shape on the page. Ugly gaps can occur, however, when the line length is too short in relation to the size of type used. So it's usually kind of a very long word, and it won't break it for you. What about if we choose to align on the left? So if we call what's called flush left or ragged right text, the left edge is hard, the right edge is soft. Word spaces do not fluctuate, so there's never big holes inside the lines of text. This format, which was used primarily for setting poetry before the 20th century, respected the flow of language rather than submitting to the law of the box. Despite its advantages, however, the flush left format is fraught with danger. Let's read on. Above all, the designer must work hard to control the appearance of the rag that forms along the right edge. A good rag looks pleasantly uneven with no lines that are excessively long or short. A rag is considered bad when it looks too even or too uneven, or begins to form irregular shapes like wedged moons or diving boards. Okay, so I think you get the point that there's sort of a sort of beauty in the kind of just noise of a ragged edge, but it starts to have kind of like a shape like the letter C or something, then it visually starts to draw you to that there's maybe conveying some extra information that is not. And similarly, you can also play around with don't be afraid of doing flush right. So when it's ragged left, this is obviously a variant. Flush right text is hard to read because it forces the reader's eye to find a new position at the start of each line. So if you think back to even last class when we were talking about human models, you have to spend time, it's a cognitive load to go find that setting, right? So you have to keep that in mind. It's very hard to read long lines of text. But used in smaller blocks, flush right text forms sort of very nice margin notes, sidebars, full quotes, passages, these things. It basically can suggest an attraction or repulsion between different pieces of text. So use that to your advantage. Often you might align it to the side to kind of throw something off. All right, punctuation. So someone again spent time beautifully designing all the punctuation for any insert sort of typography. So celebrate it, okay? So for example, there's different kinds of punctuation. I know this seems like this would be some kind of a grammar class, but the things at the top are called prime marks, and they're used for denoting things like, for example, height. So the robot is 5 feet 2 inches tall. That is not a quotation. Don't use that prime mark as a quotation. So you say, you know, it's a dog's life, or he said, that's what she said, right? So this is how you like use these. I know this sounds obvious, but here's some typography crimes found in public. Yes, people pay money to have these made. These are signs for pizza shops, and all of them, yes, all of them are just atrocious, you know, punctuation violators. Okay, even the one that said the sort of curlies or whatever it is. Notice how the apostrophe basically kind of, it grabs around the text, which is like, that's what she said. It's like up above it, okay? It shouldn't be sitting down low. It's like sitting down, crunched down in the text. It just visually looks atrocious. And I know I've ruined it for you. There's lots of pizza places you can go to. I'm sorry. Maybe you have to choose your eating establishments now. So another thing about punctuation is you've all kind of used hyphens, but just a little note that there's a lot of variations to, you know, what we call kind of a hyphen or dash. So a hyphen connects two things that are immediately related, usually words that function together as a single concept. So tie-in, toll-free, call, 2/3, these kind of things. There's another thing, an EN dash, and if you look, it's just a little bit longer. That's to connect things over a distance. So dates, page numbers, okay, things like that. It's visually the right piece of pronunciation, it's the right sort of punctuation to use. There's also an EM dash that's even longer, and you use that an EM dash allows additional thought to be added within a sentence by sort of breaking away from that sentence as I've done here, okay. Okay, and this is an example that will show you how it works. These interruptions, especially the snide remarks, are killing my buzz. Uh-oh, typography crime, right? What is up with that weird double dash? Do not put that on your poster. That will be very, very sad. Do not do that. He lived in 1890 to 1941. Capek lived longer, 1891 to 1956. Okay, there's an EN dash at the beginning and then a hyphen at the other that's wrong. It's okay to be second best, but never, ever second best. There's like a longer dash there. Just Once you notice this, you'll go, why are people not using the right dash? So let's talk about how you can also use typography to emphasize hierarchy. So emphasizing a word or phrase within a body of text usually requires only one signal. So you only have to change one property of the typography. Italics is the standard form, we mentioned that before, but there are other alternatives. So please feel free to experiment, and this is how a designer would work. You would think, maybe not just italics, maybe here I want to use boldface. Or notice how I use small caps. Or I change the color. Or I actually change the font entirely there. There is a little bit of a trick. If you do change fonts, you want to mix font families. And you, why is this dust? Obviously I typed something crazy. You want to adjust the sizes so that the X height are the same. And the X height is the height of the letter X usually. It's kind of a little more general than that, but people refer to, if you take a particular font and you look at it in a particular point size, the size of the X, that's the X size. So I had to go in and adjust the X size to make that visually look right. So feel free to experiment with these techniques. Usually it's not a good idea, as I did here, to put all of them in one place. You would choose one style you want to use consistently in your particular document or whatever you're doing. So here's another way. Let's talk about some just things that people did visually, because I want you to really think broadly when you're doing any kind of visual design, be it on a screen or on some kind of presentation or also in some printed form. So the first one here, kind of going from left to right, is you could use symbols, so using the Roman numerals and sort of these large capital letters, and there's some indentations and line breaks. That's one way to express hierarchy. Another one is you could just use indents and line breaks only. I would claim that's a little more clean because there's no reason to have all that extra kind of distracting letters, unless you deem that that's an important part of what you want to communicate. But it's a little harder to read with all that. Another way to do it would just be to do a font change, indents, and line breaks. Okay, so that's using the small caps and then the italics. Or you could actually play with the alignment altogether and a font change and line breaks. It's not that one of these is the right answer and one of them is wrong, but when you are approaching it as a designer, you don't always just go, well, I'll just do it this way because I just choose bullets. I would just choose bullets, that's what I do for. Like, think about what other way can I express that or communicate that hierarchy. So there's ways to actually combine different typography and get different effects. So combining things in a concordant way, in this example, so we're using Adobe Caslon, that's the kind of typography. We're using semi-bold, small caps, and regular at 48, 14, and 12 point. And you can see there's something like that as typography, a little bit of sort of auxiliary and sort of extra information on the actual text. Okay? So this is a way to use one particular typeface and sort of just use that as a way of actually breaking up the text to have different meaning. You can also do a contrasting styles. So in this case, we've taken Gil Sans, which is a sans serif font, and put it with a serif font, UC Berkeley's old style. And if you look visually, these are pulled apart because they're distinctly different in terms of the large difference. The easy way to do this is to choose something that's a sans serif and a serif because you can visually pull it apart. And usually 12 to 14 point fonts or things that you were doing reading text are a little bit easier often for people to read in a serif font. Now here's a conflicting style. Do not do this. So what's happened here is someone has said, let me just choose 3 totally arbitrarily different sans serif fonts and put them together. But if you see visually, that difference doesn't have the same effect as the previous 2 examples. They're different only because they're different typefaces, but they don't, they're too similar, and they also don't have enough contrasting in terms of, in this case we had very different styles, roughly serif and sans serif. And here we chose quite different sort of representations of having the small caps and the regular and the semi-bold. But think about it. It's this lettering, these typefaces can actually say a lot. This was a little fun experiment some students did of using simply the meaning of a word through spacing, sizing, and placement. That's all they did. Transition, I thought that was pretty clever. Disruption. Compression. All right, so you kind of have fun with this all day. Many of you probably don't sit around playing around with typography, but it's really a cool thing to do, and it's also when you get skilled, you'll be really excited to be able to use it in large scale and also as a communication tool. You will also see bad examples everywhere. I'm sorry about this one. Typography crime. So I'm not sure what happened here, but first of all, I don't know if you can tell, but the second line there where it says like accountability, it's basically the letter spacing has been compressed, but it's like really noticeable. There's not really a reason for it except someone just ran out of room and didn't plan correctly. You visually are kind of drawn to that because there's something different. Yet there's nothing different about accountability. There's no reason to draw attention to the word accountability. And then if you notice, even the word headquarters is a different weighting than everything else for some reason. I mean, there's a lot of other things going on, but these very subtle, you might not even notice it, but I guarantee your kind of subconscious is picking up on those variations because we talked about how visual perception cues work, and this is one of them. So they often talk about when you're making something, make it sort of like a salad, where you're sort of choosing just the best ingredients in a very small selection. Think about the best salad you had. So it wasn't like everything in it. It wasn't like every font, every typeface. It was like, that one really good heirloom tomato, that really good, cucumber. Like choose a couple really just choice, typefaces and sort of font selections and just work with them. And we'll come back to this in a minute, but clearly there's been sort of one movement to these more standard, modern, bold simplicity against this mixing of styles approach to minimalism. We'll say a little bit, I mean, obviously graphic design and graphic design history, these could be entire, multi-semester classes. And I'll just give you a very short, very modernist view of this. But clearly one recent era that happened was the Bauhaus, which was after World War I in Germany. There was a sort of rejection against the monarchy, and a lot of things were going on in Europe at the time, and against ornamentation. And there's really some different thinking about what that would be. And people really, it was an extremely creative space. Hopefully the Jacobs will be another Bauhaus movement. But the sense that people really started to play with typography in ways that had never been seen before. So and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but things with white space and alignment and gridding and all these things. One of those people was Jan Chikol, and he said, communication in the modern age should be objective, compelling, simple, short, and functional. And he was saying this not about the new iPhone or Android device. He was saying this in around 1920. And he said, he put this book out about the new typography. And it was really bold, and it talked about a move away from all these things that were happening at the time towards exclusive use of sans serif, of having non-centered text, having images play a first-class role in sort of digital typography and graphic design, standardization of paper sizes, lots of bars and grids and rules and things like that. And here's some imagery with more him using the actual visual elements as part of the kind of communication of design. He said, we have to get away from this centered, structured kind of visual communication and break things up, make things irregular, as he shows there. This is a picture from that text. So if you look, his influence was quite immediate. So Previous to that, we had a lot of center aligned text, things were very regular. This is from 1922. After he published that, we get a lot of kind of designs more like the one on the right, where people are playing with asymmetry, and you notice this is also what happens in websites now. So not everything is lined up, there's a lot of playing with that kind of visual elements. And you can see the gridding. And grid-based design is actually something that works well on mobile devices and also in sort of web applications because you often use a grid as a way of laying things out. This is what things like HTML and all of these style sheets, they work off of these grids. But grid-based design can be really powerful. You see these are sort of based on these grids. And you should think very broadly about what a grid can be. So here is a kind of very boring grid, of course, sort of very regular. And then this is sort of multi-column, but then it's playing with now maybe images cross parts of the grid. And you think about laying out a grid, you can be very transparent with it, or you can actually just sort of have it in the background. And most programs let you visually pull up and down grids, and you can drag out grid lines. And it's very powerful because aligning things and also playing with grids creates these really dramatic visual effects. So in this example, this is just some text. It's all the same text. It's something about typographical disorders. There's a little intro text, and there's 3 different kind of topics they're talking about. Here's a very standard boring layout. To the right, it's now conforming to the grid, and if you'll see visually, it starts to kind of resonate more because it has broken up the text in ways that draws your attention. It's not just sort of one running, flowing piece. But you should think about the grid broadly. Here's more examples. What if you take that same text and lay it out this way? So the sort of title, then those 3 examples. Here's another one on the right that's laid out again using the same grid. And don't be afraid to get even more sort of dramatic. This is yet another version of that. You can imagine playing with how to do grid layout. Now at some point it might be difficult to read, but this could also play into, for example, this might be a good layout if your product is really functions based on sort of a landscape and a portrait mode on a mobile phone. You want to emphasize that that's a big part of your functionality, that maybe you want to play into that in this way. And here's just a beautiful clear grid. I don't know how many people listen to or know about 99% Invisible? Yeah, okay. This is an awesome podcast. It's done right out of Oakland here. It's got Roman Mars, but you can become obsessively listen to really great kind of 15, 20-minute stories about design and design thinking, and you'll never look at the world the same way. It's very, very cool. Hopefully we get a chance to bring it into Berkeley here. So another element that often gets not mentioned is white space. So when you're designing and you're laying things out, and if you choose to do grid design or you're working with typography, you're doing all the things we're talking about, don't just clutter everything to the maximum amount. Having white space helps with drawing attention to obvious elements that are important to you, or it leaves the mind to kind of wander and discover things rather than just be overwhelmed. So you look, obviously, these are clear examples of things small. I want to emphasize how small this car is, and they sort of represented that. Now, another version could have been, let's just really, really love this car. Let's just show you the whole thing. I don't want to waste any digital bits and fill the whole screen. Would have been a very different messaging. Or even this here, where you could have adjusted and played with all the typography to kind of fill that out and balance it more. But by having that misbalance and that big white space in the middle, it makes it more dramatic. And I think white space is probably one of the things that people use the least of that really could benefit in posters and other designs. And you see them online. I mean, tons of white space. They could have put so much more text there. Just says iPad mini, there's like a lot of white space around it. And also in the sort of magazine print on the right there, there's even just white space kind of in the middle of the whole block. So white space sort of helps balance the layout or emphasize some particular object. So if there was some part of your design or your functionality you really go, I want everyone to walk away with knowing this, use white space to achieve that. It doesn't mean you just put the one thing with absolutely nothing around it. There could be other ways to deal with white space. But remember this, you'll probably remember that little example I showed, there was a little BW, because it's so dramatic. I want to say something about Dieter Rams, who's a really influential designer, thought a lot about what good design is. They actually came up with these particular properties, and I'll kind of walk through them with you. They're pretty compelling. A lot of them apply to industrial design, but they're just as applicable to working with visual design. So it says good design is innovative. So this is good for us because basically what we're really interested in is looking at technology and designing around it. And he says the possibilities for innovation are not by any means exhaustive. Technological development is always offering new opportunities for innovative design, but innovative design always develops in tandem with innovative technology and can never be an end in itself. So he's really interested in bringing essentially the ideas of technology into design. Good design makes a product useful. Sounds like a topic for this class, right? That's all we talk about is sort of useful or usability. A product is brought to be used. It has to satisfy certain criteria, not only functional, but also psychological and aesthetic. Good design emphasizes the usefulness of a product while disregarding anything that could possibly distract from it. Now, you could also spin this and think of it in the context of this class. We talk about other visual elements distract you. It's more cognitive load. You have to then think about what state is the system in. There's all these things that's why good design relates to human-computer interaction. It's also aesthetic. You want to live with these objects, so they should have some aesthetic value. So he says that the aesthetic quality of a product is integral to its usefulness because products we use every day affect our person and our well-being, but only well-executed objects can be beautiful. And good design makes a product understandable. This is a little bit of the things we talked about several weeks ago with affordances and things like that. So it clarifies the product structure. Better still, it can make the product talk. At best, it's self-explanatory. We talked about how when you have things, they just have this sense of how they're supposed to be used. They visually communicate that in their actual design. Good design is unobtrusive. So products fulfilling a purpose are like tools. They're neither decorative objects nor works of art. Their design should therefore be neutral and restrained to leave room for the user's self-expression. So you want to sort of make them your own. You don't want a sort of designer to tell you everything about how it's supposed to be used. Good design is honest. Okay, so some of this design can be deceptive. You can sort of trick people and say, don't do that. It does not make a product more innovative, powerful, or valuable than it really is. It does not attempt to manipulate the consumer with promises that cannot be met. So it shouldn't, this might speak to even things like skeuomorphism, right? Where things you think the design actually communicates that maybe you can tear off the page or you can sort of do things that you can't do. Good design is long lasting. So it sort of avoids trends and sort of fashion. It kind of has this longevity. Good design is thorough down to the last detail. And by that, it's largely that when you look at something, the reason why you're usually drawn to it is someone actually thought about everything. It wasn't just the, your phone and the kind of visual icons. It's the shape, it's the size, and how you hold it, how heavy it feels. It's the actual texture of it. All those things were thought of when it came to design. And so it's good to the last drop, essentially. Good design is environmentally friendly, so it reflects things about sustainability and sort of durability. And finally, good design is as little design as possible. So less is better because it concentrates on the essential aspects and the products are not burdened with non-essentials. Okay. Another issue with design is this idea of sort of form follows function. So the form of it actually is driven by the function. And we saw that earlier in the semester. We're playing with the measuring cup, but also Philip Stark and this juicer that they have. And good design should be sort of a pleasure to use. Okay. And I think that's one of the reasons that, for example, things like the iPod were so successful, because they played into this beauty and simplicity of design and selecting songs. There were many other products on the market that let you choose and listen to music, and it was the exact same song, it sounded the same, and there was no variation in that. It was just the aesthetics and the way of interacting with it that drove that desire. So there's often trends that happen. So one of them was streamlining. So this is where people basically took, this is a really interesting photograph that shows the automobile and rail cars and sort of other modes of transportation, how they were influenced by this notion of speed and sort of streamlining, that things were going faster, and that was a sort of message promoter. And you can sort of see how even trains at the time moved from this kind of to this more streamlined. Sometimes that is reflected in modern products. Is this going too far? It's a pencil sharpener. I don't know how fast your pencil sharpener is, but it can also stylistically tie in. So, but it's just careful to kind of watch that. Now, design closer to kind of HCI is some work by Henry Dreyfuss, who looked at human factors. And he was one of the first individuals that said, let's actually try to mathematically figure out like, what is, for example, the human body, like how does it move, where are the kind of ranges, what's sort of the limits of comfortable movement, grasping, holding. And he thought, well, let's characterize this, much like when we're looking at kind of the human model for, calculation in the head with cognitive processors and visual processors, and sort of what is the kind of mechanics of a person. And he's responsible for a lot of designs, like this sort of telephone, which probably none of you used. I don't know, did anyone have no one had like a rotary, do you have something like that? Yeah, no one had a rotary dial phone in their home, did you? Maybe? No, okay. That should be like, wow. So here's what he did, just because it has this really nice flow connected to how we talk about iterative design and HCI. So he would go out and sort of talk with people, he would make drawings, he would visit to watch how things were made, he'd watch how people use products, he would design prototypes, and then he would bring them out and have people do kind of user studies, he would watch what they're doing and do redesigns with it, kind of go through this iterative cycle. So it's very much influenced by how we even do design now. This form follows function, and some of those work sometimes also goes a little excessive. Anyone been to the Pompidou in seen this building? So it's the Pompidou in Paris. So the idea was to take all of the internals of a building, like the heating ducts and water, and instead of hiding them, because they've been hidden around Jacobs, what if we actually push them out? You could see all the guts of the building kind of hanging out. I actually like this building, so I kind of think it's like so aggressively, boldly different that I kind of think it's really appropriate as a kind of artist museum. But it does sort of dictate, at least it probably might not function as a home as much as it functions as a contemporary art museum or modern art museum. Okay. So one of the themes also is to look at how to make things very simple and therefore get to this elegance. And you can tell that that happens a lot with design. One of the things you don't often hear in classes is just steal stuff. So I'm telling you, and even Pablo Picasso says, good artists borrow, but great artists steal. Okay, so and this is true, compelling visual design takes practice and experience in a natural way, which is study and critique of others' work. So you should look at others' work. That's why even in this class, I can't tell you the 5 rules to like the perfect design, but through, I think what will be a little bit more the latter half of this class, you'll get to see their work and we'll be critiquing different things across, and you'll be able to kind of borrow some things that you think are working well for other groups, and you'll see how things are maybe not working and make changes. So simplicity is really about kind of this minimalist design, and it's often the sort of simplest solution often conveys the most, and it gets rid of this extra adornment or linkages or mechanical issues. And because of that, you have this elegance. So it's only the essential elements at play. You don't have a lot of extra elements. It uses a single set. That can be something like using a single set of colors or shapes consistently and not adding lots of different other visual elements. Using them in different roles, so taking the same form, a circle or some kind of ellipse, and kind of reusing it consistently to have that kind of design language. And you can also use it in multiple roles. So a couple benefits, and these are things that you'll see the same thing we talked about earlier coming up when we talk about design more as design from earlier in the semester. Approachability. Visual elements rapidly understood and invite further exploration. So this is more kind of factor sort of affordances, things that sort of read, they have a legibility. You look at them, they're immediately apparent what they do. There's a knob, you turn it, that's like pretty clear. And also, less visual clutter makes it easy to recognize where the interaction should take place. So the obvious example, the Polaroid camera, besides all these other things, it was just so simple. It's like you really just hit one button. And the eye is drawn to the important visual elements. So you see this with a lot of websites that work well. You look, I even sort of pulled Google's newest version of their homepage, and they just even more simplicity, and your visual elements drawn to their primary product, which is searching. Right, so they've got that. They've even gotten rid of all this other stuff from even a couple of years ago. And if you do this correctly, you can have this sense of unity where things are drawn together because of a consistent sort of design language. So they have unifying themes. So if you look, this phone has sort of the shape that has a way of speaking that they go together. These pieces go together. Or the typography, or the sort of shape and the arrangement, or the sort of representation of kind of people on these signs are all consistent. And when you get that, it's really talking about a design language. Or this can also be thought of as a design vocabulary. This is a good thing to think about before you set out. Maybe you're getting ready, you've sort of got your project to a certain point, or even another class, or maybe something you're going to pitch to someone. Think about what the design language is you want to use. So use the canonical examples, things like cars. Like if you look, the BMW, no matter what BMW has this grille that that's kind of their branding, but it's also their design language. That grille is an element that is played out in every sort of model, that sort of style. You can imagine if I went and created a BMW that didn't have that grille, you'd probably say, that doesn't look like a BMW, it's that branded. But a design language or design vocabulary is an overarching scheme or style that guides the design of a complement of products or architectural settings. Designers wishing to give their suite of products a unique but consistent look and feel define a design language for it, which can describe choices for design aspects such as the material, color schemes, shapes, patterns, textures, or layout. And you follow the scheme for the objects. And you see this all the time. When it's done well, once you have that design language working, and it could be something with just typography choice, color choice, a layout, the grid is the same. So this is like such an obvious example, but this very simple sort of red circle with this blue sort of rectangle across for the London Underground. And you'll notice you can find that same representation in, of course, the station stops, Paddington and Westminster and elsewhere. It's across all the London transportation system, and then it's also even in the signage inside the stations about how to go in and out and exit. So you want to use a consistent design language. Choose, if you'll throw things off, even if you decide this is my kind of color palette, and you start to vary it slightly, it will throw off the entire kind of design language. Now, another thing about doing these simplicity and elegance is also getting rid of and refining things. And another perfect example, staying on the London Underground, is this when they took essentially the lines, which are shown on the right, geographically accurate of where they're actually located and all the bends and curves and what happens, and simplifying it by sort of putting it again into just a grid alignment. And it's basically laid out in a way that's much more legible because you don't have to trace it through every little slight bend and curve. And it emphasizes the sequence of the stops, which is really what you're concerned about, not exactly the kind of latitude and longitude of each one. So it's visually easier to read, and it communicates the right information. So when Harry Beck did this, that's why it sort of has that appeal. And we have numerous examples we've seen throughout the class of when clutter and things get really distracting. Okay, so obviously bad examples from drawing application. You also get problems with interference. So when things are not visually consistent, for example, the two edit menus have different ways of telling you about the shortcuts. So one of them is telling you kind of words and text, they're just a little bit different. And also, this is an alignment tool used sometimes in something maybe like InDesign or Illustrator, and it's using different shapes, which can confuse people sometimes, the way that it's for the alignment. Another thing is if there's too much structure. So in here, there's a lot of structure around this is enclosed in this, this is enclosed in this, and look at how many boxes and levels. And it's important, but there's other ways to visually pull them together. Or you could also ask yourself, is all of this have to be visible at one time? So when that happens, it just becomes too much visual clutter. Also, when you sort of belabor the obvious, this is one of our examples from Microsoft Bob from before. Or gratuitous use of 3D, so if you're making graphs, and sometimes you end up adding a lot of three-dimensional. Look at how cool is my program lets me do 3D graphs. It's so much. Look at the results are so much cooler. It's like that's not even readable. I can't even tell from that perspective what is going on. Or this other example here where it's not really clear there's any reason that these have to be three-dimensional sort of selections. Some people actually also dislike lots of extra embellishments, and we talked about this earlier with this idea of simplicity. If you think about how at least some of these operating systems used to start out, this is like Windows has a lot of extra stuff going on, whereas if it just had a music logo and it was very simple, it communicates visually, the music is about to start, you're about to be in this kind of application rather than, who's going to read all that? There could be other ways to do attribution, and that's how you think creatively about that. Okay, I'm going to talk about color briefly. And I think we'll take a break. So color obviously hugely important when you're deciding how to choose a visual design, be it with the typography or background or foreground or any kind of choices with visual imagery. And a lot of this but to remind everyone, there's a lot of different color spaces too that you're pretty well aware of are RGB and CMY or CMYK. And they're really about, at least these two speak to the kind of additive or subtractive property of light. So for electronic media, usually you're throwing light on it. So it's this RGB, you're adding light. Whereas subtractive, when you're kind of printing or something, you use this other color space. Now, what happens is there's lots of ways to map this, which is great, but also creates a lot of problems. So, there's these nice hex codes that you could take for RGB or these other color spaces, but it's not really the way you might think about color, and it creates, lime green and hot pink, all these sort of colors that are not really desirable for graphic design. Another way to think of it is this kind of more perceptual organization, where it's this hue, saturation, and value in some sense. So this idea that you work your way around the different hues or colors and you can saturate them, that's the kind of colorfulness. And there's also the brightness. Now again, we could spend an entire, probably 2 or 3 classes on color, and I'm just gonna be really sort of more brief about it, but emphasize a lot of obvious things. Some tricks for picking colors. So one thing to notice is pick a limited color palette. When you're gonna do something, start off and think about, here's the few colors that I can choose. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But for example, when Java first came out, it used only 6 colors to represent all the kind of UI elements. Don't rely on fully saturated colors. So this is an example of someone using really saturated colors. They become too blinding and they draw your attention to the wrong elements of the visual design. And also ensure good color contrast for text. So this is like a really obvious bad example. And again, there are many, many tools. I'll just mention one because, again, it's one of your, I think, things you get in the Adobe suite for you guys. But Adobe has its own color tool for choosing colors. And if you look, I'm not going to kind of demo the whole thing. We're going to have a little session after the midterm about working with color a little more depth. But this lets you easily walk around a color space, and it has tools to let you quickly choose colors that are complementary, those that contrast. There's different ways to play with this that we'll go into a little bit later in the semester. But if you notice, it's not letting you choose 20 colors. It's letting you choose this little palette of 5 colors to work with. And you can see how it depends on what you're trying to design and what kind of energy you want, but they're sort of complementary in some sense. Okay, I'm going to leave Gestalt principles. We'll do that after lunch because I want to stop. I'll post the slides. I realized I forgot to post them this morning, so I'll post them at lunch. Let me explain what we're going to do now. Is people are going to hang out, but I have to bring the watches because they're downstairs in my office. I'll bring them up here, and you're going to hear, if you're the person from your group, or if you just want to talk to us, you're welcome, but many of the GSIs are going to be here, and you will come up, and we will check your name off, because you've already filled out the Google form, right, because you guys are awesome, you did feedback too, and then we would check from you for $125. Please don't let it be a cashier's check. Please don't let it be like currency, unless you want us to go to Vegas. 150, sorry, 150. And we're just going to write down information about the serial number and things like that. What we're expecting out of you is that you maintain all of the sort of kit and caboodle in good shape, because we will use these watches next semester. So that means, you know, keep the box, keep all the sort of parts, don't lose the power charger, all these other things. So put that in your little special part of your whatever apartment or dorm or whatever, and then at the end of the semester, you'll just have to bring it back, we'll sign it off, you'll get your $150 check, and then you're off to Vegas and you can do it whatever you want. Okay? Have I made the right announcement, Cesar, or do we want to add to this before?
No.
Okay. Okay, so I'll be around a little bit. Don't like rush us yet, because I have to go get the watches. It takes like about 2 or 3 minutes. And then after lunch, we'll pick up with the Gestalt principles and some other things. Okay. Thanks, everyone. All right. I had them last night too. Yeah, well.